The bitter December wind cut through the New Mexico territory like a knife through skin, and Matthew O'Connor's fingers were so cold they barely felt the reins anymore as he rode into Socorro on that gray afternoon in 1878. He had been traveling for 3 weeks straight, chasing down horses for the ranch he worked on, and all he wanted was a hot meal, a warm bed, and maybe something strong enough to burn away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. But what he got instead was the sight of Penelope Jordan standing in front of her small house at the edge of town, trying to calm a massive bay gelding that was clearly too much horse for her to handle alone. Matthew pulled his own mount to a stop and watched for a moment, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. The woman was maybe 24 or 25, dressed in widow's black that seemed too thin for the weather. Her dark blonde hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty if it was not so pinched with cold and worry. The horse, a draft animal built for pulling carriages rather than riding, was stomping its feet and tossing its head, but there was something gentle in the way it moved, as if it was trying very hard not to hurt the woman even as it expressed its distress. "Easy now, Benjamin," the woman was saying, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook. "Easy, boy. I know you are cold. I know you miss him." Matthew dismounted and walked over slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. "Excuse me, miss," he called out when he was still a good distance away. "Looks like you could use some help there." The woman's head snapped around, and he saw her eyes were a striking gray-green, the color of sage in springtime. "I am managing just fine, thank you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, and the horse chose that exact moment to sidestep away from her, nearly pulling the lead rope from her frozen fingers. "I can see that," Matthew said, not unkindly. He came closer, holding out one hand to the horse, letting the animal smell him. The gelding's nostrils flared, but after a moment it lowered its head and allowed Matthew to stroke its neck. "He is a fine animal, Carriage horse by the looks of him." "He was my husband's," the woman said quietly. "Thomas passed 4 months ago. Fever took him fast." "I am sorry for your loss, madam." Matthew kept his hand on the horse, feeling the warmth of the animal through his glove. "My name is Matthew O'Connor. I work at the Silver Creek Ranch about 15 miles north of here." "Penelope Jordan," she replied, and now that the horse was calm, she seemed to relax slightly as well. "Mrs. Penelope Jordan, though I suppose it makes little difference anymore." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and Matthew noticed how thin she looked, how the wind seemed to cut right through her dress. "Have you been trying to feed this fellow all by yourself?" he asked, nodding toward the small stable behind her house. "Benjamin is all I have left of Thomas," Penelope said, and there was a fierce defensiveness in her voice now. "But the feed costs more than I can manage, and the wood for heat, and everything else. I have been taking in sewing, but it is not enough, so I have decided to sell him." The words seemed to pain her as much as any physical wound, and Matthew felt something twist in his chest. He knew that kind of grief, that kind of desperate necessity that forced you to give up the things you loved just to survive another day. His own mother had sold her wedding ring after his father died, and he could still remember the way she had cried while counting out the coins the shopkeeper had given her. "How much are you asking?" He heard himself say, even though he had not come to Socorro looking to buy a horse, especially not a draft animal that would be of limited use on a cattle ranch. Penelope named a price that was far too low for an animal of Benjamin's size and obvious good health, and Matthew knew immediately that she was either desperate enough not to care or ignorant enough of horse trading not to know better. Probably both. "That seems fair," he said carefully. "Though I should tell you, you could probably get twice that from someone who needs a carriage horse for business." She shook her head. I do not have time to wait for the right buyer. Winter is here, and I need the money now. Besides, Benjamin deserves someone who will treat him well, and you have a kind way with him. I can see that. Matthew found himself agreeing to the purchase, counting out coins from his own wages, money he had been saving for a new saddle and winter boots. But when he looked at Penelope's face, saw the mixture of relief and sorrow there, he knew he could not walk away. Some things mattered more than new leather and warm feet. The transaction was completed quickly, with Penelope writing out a simple bill of sale in careful, precise handwriting that spoke of some education, some life before this poverty and grief. Matthew noticed how her hand shook as she wrote, whether from cold or emotion he could not tell. I will come back tomorrow to collect him, Matthew said, folding the paper and tucking it into his coat pocket. That will give you time to say a proper goodbye. Penelope's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. That is kind of you, Mr. O'Connor, very kind. Just Matthew, please, he said, and it is nothing more than common decency. He returned to his horse and rode toward the center of Socorro, toward the boarding house where he planned to spend the night. But he found his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman in black, and the horse she loved enough to let go. There was something about her, some quality of quiet strength beneath the obvious hardship, that called to him in a way he had not expected. The next morning dawned even colder than the day before, with a razor-sharp wind that promised snow before nightfall. Matthew ate a quick breakfast of coffee and biscuits, then headed back to Penelope's house, leading a rope behind his saddle for Benjamin. He had spent half the night trying to figure out where he was going to keep a draft horse, how he was going to explain this purchase to his boss. But every time he considered just telling Penelope the deal was off, he remembered the look in her eyes and knew he could not do it. When he arrived at the small house, he found Penelope already outside with Benjamin, both of them looking miserable in the cutting wind. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and the horse's coat was freshly brushed, his mane combed out carefully. "Good morning," Matthew called as he dismounted. "You did not have to bring him out. I could have fetched him from the stable." "I wanted to make sure he looked his best," Penelope said, and her voice was thick with unshed tears. "He was always such a proud animal when Thomas drove him. He deserves to leave here with some dignity." Matthew nodded and approached Benjamin, running his hands over the horse's legs and checking his hooves, more for Penelope's benefit than his own. The animal was clearly in good condition, well cared for despite the obvious financial hardship. That spoke volumes about the woman's character. "He is in fine shape," Matthew said. "You have done right by him, Mrs. Jordan. Please call me Penelope," she said softly. "I think we are past such formalities now." Matthew attached his lead rope to Benjamin's halter and prepared to mount his own horse. But before he could, Penelope stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Benjamin's neck, burying her face in his mane. The horse stood perfectly still, as if he understood this was goodbye, and Matthew had to look away from the raw emotion of the moment. "I am so sorry," Penelope whispered to the horse. "I am so sorry, Benjamin. You have been such a good friend to me. Please forgive me." After a long moment, she stepped back, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Take good care of him," she said to Matthew. "He does not like loud noises, and he prefers apples to sugar cubes, and if you speak to him gently, he will do anything you ask." "I will remember all of that," Matthew promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. He mounted his own horse and started to lead Benjamin away, but they had not gotten more than 20 feet when the big gelding suddenly planted his hooves and refused to move. Matthew clicked his tongue and gave a gentle tug on the rope, but Benjamin just tossed his head and pulled backward. "Come on, boy," Matthew said, turning in his saddle. "Time to go now." But Benjamin was not listening. Instead, the horse was staring back at Penelope, who was still standing in front of her house, one hand pressed to her mouth. The animal let out a long, plaintive whinny that seemed to echo across the frozen landscape, a sound of such pure longing that it made Matthew's throat tighten. "Benjamin, please," Penelope called, and now the tears were streaming down her face. "You have to go with him. You have to." But the horse refused to budge. Matthew dismounted and walked back to Benjamin, stroking his neck and speaking in low, soothing tones, but nothing worked. The animal simply would not move forward. Every time Matthew tried to lead him away from Penelope's house, Benjamin would dig in his hooves and pull back toward the woman who had cared for him. After 10 minutes of this, with the wind howling around them and snow beginning to fall in tiny, stinging flakes, Matthew had to admit defeat. He led both horses back to Penelope's stable, where Benjamin immediately settled, his distress evaporating the moment he was back on familiar ground. Penelope had followed them, her face a mask of confusion and despair. "I do not understand," she said. "He has never behaved this way before. Thomas used to take him all over the territory, and he was always so good about loading and traveling." "Maybe he knows things are different now," Matthew said, more to himself than to her. "Maybe he knows you need him more than I do." "But I cannot keep him," Penelope said, and her voice broke. "I cannot afford to feed him through the winter. I can barely afford to feed myself." Matthew stood in the stable, watching the snowflakes swirl outside, and made a decision that would change everything. "Then I will help you," he said simply. "I will bring feed for Benjamin, and in return, perhaps you could do some mending for me. My shirts are more whole than fabric at this point, and I am terrible with a needle." Penelope stared at him as if he had grown a second head. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious," Matthew said. "Look, I already paid you for the horse, and the horse clearly wants to stay with you. I am not going to force an animal to leave its home, not when there might be another solution. Let me think on this for a day or two. In the meantime, you keep Benjamin here, and I will make sure he has what he needs." "That is not fair to you," Penelope protested. But Matthew could see the hope beginning to dawn in her eyes, the desperate, fragile hope of someone who had been drowning and suddenly felt solid ground beneath her feet. "Let me worry about what is fair to me," Matthew said. "Right now, I need to find a place to stay in town for a few more days while I figure this out. Do you know of any boarding houses with reasonable rates?" "Mrs. Chen runs a place on the main street," Penelope said slowly. "She is fair with her prices and keeps a clean establishment." Matthew nodded his thanks and started to leave, but Penelope reached out and caught his sleeve. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her gray-green eyes searching his face. "You do not know me. You have no reason to help me." He could have given her any number of practical answers, could have talked about the horse, or the business arrangement, or simple Christian charity. But when he looked at her, standing there in the falling snow with her widow's weeds and her fierce pride and her breaking heart, he found himself telling the truth. "Because I know what it is like to lose everything," he said quietly. "And because sometimes, when the world is cold and cruel, the smallest act of kindness can mean the difference between giving up and holding on. My mother taught me that before she passed." Penelope's expression softened, and for a moment they simply stood there in the stable, two people who understood loss in a way that bound them together more surely than any words could. Then she nodded and released his sleeve, stepping back. "Thank you, Matthew," she said. "Thank you for not taking him away from me. Thank you for trusting me enough to try to sell him in the first place," Matthew replied. "That took courage." He left her there with Benjamin and rode back into Socorro proper, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. The situation was not sustainable as it stood. He could not keep paying for a horse's upkeep indefinitely, not on a ranch hand's wages, and Penelope clearly needed more help than just feed for her animal. But there had to be a solution, some way to make this work that would not leave either of them destitute. Over the next few days, Matthew found himself spending more and more time at Penelope's small house. He brought hay and oats for Benjamin, as promised, but he also brought firewood and coffee and sugar, small things that he noticed she was lacking. In return, she mended his shirts and sewed new buttons on his coat, and they began to talk. He learned that she was 26, 3 years younger than himself, and that she had come to Socorro from Missouri 5 years earlier as a mail-order bride to Thomas Jordan, a businessman 20 years her senior who had made his living running a carriage service. Thomas had been kind to her in his way, but theirs had been a practical marriage rather than a romantic one, and when he died, he left her with little more than debts and a horse. She learned that Matthew had been born in Texas, the son of Irish immigrants who had tried to make a go of farming before drought and debt forced them to give up their land. His father had died when Matthew was 15, his mother when he was 22, and he had been drifting ever since, working ranches and trying to save enough money to buy a small piece of land he could call his own. They were both orphans of a sort, both trying to build lives from the wreckage of old dreams, and that shared understanding created a bond between them that grew stronger with each passing day. On the 4th day, Matthew came by in the evening after finishing his work at the Silver Creek Ranch. He had explained the situation to his boss, a gruff but fair-minded man named Samuel Reed, who had agreed to let Matthew keep irregular hours for a week or so as long as the work got done. Matthew had a feeling Reed suspected there was more to this than just a horse, but the older man had not pride, for which Matthew was grateful. When he arrived at Penelope's house, he found her sitting at her small kitchen table, surrounded by scraps of fabric and spools of thread. She looked exhausted, her face pale in the lamplight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that had not been there a few days before. "You are working too hard," Matthew said without preamble, setting down the basket of food he had brought. "When did you last have a full night's sleep?" "I could ask you the same question," Penelope replied, but there was no heat in her voice, only weariness. "You have been riding back and forth between your ranch and Socorro every day. That cannot be easy on you." "I am used to hard work," Matthew said. "But you look like you are about to fall over. When did you last eat a real meal?" Penelope looked away, and that was answer enough. Matthew felt anger rise in his chest, not at her but at the circumstances that had brought her to this point, at a world that could leave a woman alone and struggling with no support and no options. "That ends now," he said firmly. "I brought chicken and bread and vegetables. We are going to eat dinner together, and you are going to tell me exactly what your situation is. All of it. The debts, the income, everything. And then we are going to figure out a real solution to this, not just putting bandages on a wound that needs stitches." For a moment, he thought she might refuse, might retreat behind that wall of pride that kept her from asking for help even when she desperately needed it. But then her shoulders sagged, and she nodded. Over dinner, eaten at her small table while the wind howled outside and Benjamin stamped peacefully in the stable, Penelope laid out the grim reality of her finances. Thomas had left her with $300 in debts to various merchants in town, money owed for feed and supplies for the carriage business that had dried up in the months before his death. She had been paying it off bit by bit with her sewing money, but the cost of heating her house and feeding herself and Benjamin meant that she was barely making any progress. At her current rate, it would take her 2 years to clear the debt, assuming no emergencies or unexpected expenses. "And if you sell Benjamin?" Matthew asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then I could pay off most of it," Penelope admitted. "But I would still be short and I would be alone, completely alone." She said the last words so softly that Matthew almost missed them, but when he looked at her face, he saw the truth written there. Benjamin was not just a horse to her. He was the last connection to her life with Thomas, the last living thing that depended on her and needed her. If she lost him, she would have nothing and no one. "There has to be another way," Matthew said, thinking out loud. "What if you could use Benjamin for work? Use him the way Thomas did for the carriage business?" "I do not know how to drive a carriage," Penelope said. "And even if I did, Thomas sold the carriage itself 6 months before he died, when money was tight. All I have is Benjamin and the old tack." Matthew drummed his fingers on the table, his mind working through possibilities. What about freight? A horse like Benjamin could pull a wagon, haul supplies for the merchants in town. That is steady work, and it does not require a fancy carriage. "I do not have a wagon," Penelope pointed out, "and I still do not know how to drive." "I could teach you," Matthew said. "And as for a wagon, I might know where to get one cheap. Old Pete Alvarez has been trying to sell his freight wagon for months now. His back is too bad for the work anymore, and his son's moved to California. He might let it go for a reasonable price, especially if he knew it was going to someone who really needed it." For the first time since Matthew had met her, he saw real hope spark in Penelope's eyes. "Do you really think that could work?" she asked. "Do you think I could make enough to pay off the debts and keep Benjamin?" "I think it is worth trying," Matthew said. "And I think you are stronger than you give yourself credit for. You have been surviving on your own for 4 months now. Learning to drive a wagon is nothing compared to that." Over the next 2 weeks, Matthew became a regular fixture at Penelope's house. He negotiated with Pete Alvarez and managed to buy the old freight wagon for a price that Penelope could afford if she stretched her resources thin. Then he began teaching her how to handle Benjamin with the wagon, how to back him up and turn him and navigate the narrow streets of Socorro. It was hard work, and there were moments of frustration on both sides. Penelope had never done anything like this before, had been raised to be a merchant's wife rather than a teamster, and her hands blistered from the reins and her back ached from the unfamiliar posture. But she learned quickly, driven by necessity and determination, and Matthew found himself admiring her more with each passing day. She was not like any woman he had known before. She did not simper or play coy or pretend to be helpless when she was not. When she struggled with something, she said so plainly, and when she succeeded, she allowed herself a moment of genuine pride. She was honest and direct and refreshingly real, and Matthew discovered that he looked forward to their lessons with an eagerness that had little to do with teaching and everything to do with simply being near her. For her part, Penelope found herself drawn to Matthew in ways that surprised and somewhat frightened her. Her marriage to Thomas had been comfortable but passionless, a business arrangement that served both their needs but never touched her heart. Matthew was different. He was patient and kind, yes, but there was also a quiet strength to him, a competence and capability that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her father died when she was 16. More than that, he treated her as an equal. He did not talk down to her or assume she was incapable just because she was a woman. When she had an idea about the business, he listened seriously and considered it on its merits. When she made a mistake, he corrected her gently and showed her how to do better. He respected her intelligence and her ability to learn, and that respect meant more to Penelope than all the pretty words in the world. By the end of the 2nd week, Penelope was competent enough with the wagon that Matthew felt confident she could start taking on small hauling jobs. He spoke to several of the merchants he knew in Socorro, putting in good words for her, and within a few days, she had her first job hauling supplies from the train depot to the general store. Matthew went with her on that first run, sitting beside her on the wagon seat as she guided Benjamin through the streets. Her hands were steady on the reins, her focus complete, and when they successfully delivered the goods and she received her payment, the smile on her face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I did it," she said, looking at the coins in her hand as if they were the greatest treasure in the world. "I actually did it." "You did," Matthew agreed, and he found himself grinning like a fool, delighted by her delight. "And you will do it again tomorrow and the day after that. You are going to make this work, Penelope. I know it." She turned to him then, her gray-green eyes shining, and for a moment Matthew forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful when she smiled like that, truly beautiful, and he realized with a start that he wanted to make her smile like that every day for the rest of his life. The thought should have terrified him. He barely knew her. They had met less than 3 weeks ago. He had no business thinking about her in those terms, not when she was a recent widow and he was a ranch hand with nothing to offer but hard work and good intentions. But the heart, he was learning, did not care much about logic or propriety or good sense. The heart wanted what it wanted, and Matthew's heart wanted Penelope Jordan with an intensity that left him shaken. Christmas came and went quietly. Matthew spent the day with Penelope, helping her with a particularly large hauling job that one of the merchants had requested. They worked together in companionable silence, the kind of silence that only comes between people who are truly comfortable with each other. And when the job was done, Penelope invited him inside for coffee and the cake she had baked. "It is not much," she said, setting a simple spice cake on the table, "but it seemed wrong not to mark the day somehow." "It is perfect," Matthew said, and he meant it. He had spent the last several Christmases alone or in bunkhouses with other ranch hands. And this quiet domestic moment with a woman he was coming to care for deeply, was more precious to him than any grand celebration. They ate cake and drank coffee, and Penelope told him about Christmases from her childhood in Missouri, when her parents were still alive and the world seemed full of possibility. Matthew told her about his own memories, about his mother's singing and his father's terrible jokes, and they laughed together over stories of holidays past. As the evening wore on and the lamplight grew softer, Matthew found himself moving closer to Penelope on the small settee where they sat. She did not pull away, and when their shoulders touched, she leaned into him slightly, as if seeking his warmth. "Thank you for this," she said quietly, "for everything. I do not know what I would have done without your help these past weeks." "You would have found a way," Matthew said. "You are stronger than you know, Penelope." "Maybe," she said, "but it is easier with you here. Everything is easier with you." Matthew's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. He turned to look at her and found her already looking at him, her face soft and open in the lamplight. "Penelope," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something. I need to be honest with you about what I am feeling." "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too, Matthew. I have been feeling it for days now, and I did not know what to do about it." "You are a widow," Matthew said. "There are proprieties, expectations. I do not want to dishonor Thomas's memory or put you in an awkward position." Penelope reached out and took his hand, her fingers threading through his. "Thomas was a good man and I cared for him," she said. "But what we had was not a love match. It was practical and comfortable, and that was enough at the time. But you, Matthew, what I feel for you is different. It is more." and I do not want to waste time worrying about what people might think when I have already lost so much time to duty and propriety and doing what was expected of me." Matthew's hand tightened on hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because once I say this, I cannot take it back. I am falling in love with you, Penelope. Maybe I have been falling since that first day I saw you trying to calm Benjamin in the cold, and if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then I want to court you properly, if you will let me." Penelope's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I will let you," she whispered. "I want that very much." Matthew leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she did not. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise, a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings and the courage it took to love again after loss. When they finally pulled apart, both a little breathless, Penelope laughed softly. "I never thought I would feel this way again," she said. "I thought that part of my life was over." "It is just beginning," Matthew said and kissed her again, deeper this time, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. They sat together for a long time that night, talking and kissing and making plans for a future that was starting to look brighter than either of them had dared to imagine. Matthew knew there would be challenges ahead. There always were. But with Penelope beside him, he felt like he could face anything. The winter deepened, and with it, the relationship between Matthew and Penelope deepened as well. He courted her properly, as he had promised, bringing her small gifts and taking her to church on Sundays, and making sure that everyone in Socorro knew his intentions were honorable. Some of the older women in town clucked their tongues and whispered that Penelope should wait a full year before entertaining suitors, but most people seemed to approve. Matthew had a good reputation as a hard worker and an honest man, and everyone could see that Penelope was blooming under his attention, losing that pinched, desperate look and becoming vibrant and alive. Penelope's hauling business was growing too. Word had spread that she was reliable and hardworking and charged fair prices, and she found herself with more work than she could handle some weeks. Matthew helped when he could, taking on jobs on his days off from the ranch, and together they managed to start making real progress on her debts. By February, Penelope had paid off half of what she owed, and the remaining creditors, seeing that she was making a genuine effort, agreed to extend her payment terms. The pressure that had been crushing her for months began to ease, and she could finally breathe without feeling like she was drowning. Matthew, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own decisions. He loved his work at the Silver Creek Ranch, loved the open spaces and the cattle and the physical demands of the job. But the ranch was 15 miles from Socorro, and every day he spent away from Penelope felt like a waste. He wanted to be near her, to build a life with her, and that meant making some changes. In early March, after much thought and several sleepless nights, Matthew approached Samuel Reed in the ranch office. Reed was a weathered man in his mid-50s, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "Boss, I need to talk to you about my situation here," Matthew began. Reed leaned back in his chair and regarded Matthew steadily. "This is about that woman in Socorro, is it not? The widow with the freight wagon." "Her name is Penelope," Matthew said. "And yes, it is about her. I want to marry her, sir, if she will have me. But that means I need to be in Socorro, not out here." "I figured as much," Reed said, not unkindly. "You have been distracted for weeks now, though I will say you have never let it affect your work. You are still the best hand I have got." "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Reed drummed his fingers on the desk. "So what are you proposing? You want to quit?" "I do not want to," Matthew said honestly. "But I cannot keep riding back and forth. It is wearing on me and my horse both. I need to find work in Socorro or close to it." Reed was silent for a long moment, then he leaned forward. "What if I told you I have been thinking about expanding operations? I have been buying cattle from small ranchers all over this part of New Mexico, and I need someone in Socorro to handle the livestock brokering side of things. Someone I can trust to give fair prices and not cheat me or the sellers. It would mean giving up ranch work and doing more business negotiations, record keeping, that kind of thing, but it would be based in Socorro." Matthew felt hope surge in his chest. "Are you serious? Do I look like a man who jokes about business?" Reed asked dryly. "I have been considering this for months, but I needed the right person. You are honest, you know cattle, and you have good instincts about people. Plus, you already have connections in Socorro now. It makes sense." "The pay would be the same?" Matthew asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Better, actually," Reed said. "You would be taking on more responsibility. I would start you at $40 a month with potential for more if the business does well." $40 a month was nearly twice what Matthew was making as a ranch hand. It was real money, the kind of money that could support a family, that could build a future. "I accept," Matthew said immediately. "Thank you, sir. You will not regret this." "I know I will not," Reed said. "Now get out of here and go tell that woman of yours, and Matthew, invite me to the wedding. I do like a good celebration." Matthew rode to Socorro that very afternoon, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He found Penelope at the freight depot, overseeing the loading of her wagon for an afternoon delivery. She looked up when he called her name, and the smile that spread across her face made the 15-mile ride worthwhile. "Matthew, I was not expecting you until Sunday." "I have news," he said, dismounting and walking over to her. "Big news." He told her everything, about his conversation with Reed, about the new job, about the pay increase and what it could mean for them. Penelope listened with growing excitement, her eyes shining. "That is wonderful," she exclaimed when he finished. "Matthew, that is perfect. You will be here in Socorro, and we can. We can get married," Matthew said, taking both her hands in his. "If you will have me. I know we have only known each other a few months and I do not have much to offer yet, but I love you, Penelope. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. And I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, if you will let me." Penelope's answer was to throw her arms around his neck and kiss him right there in the middle of the freight depot, in full view of anyone who cared to look. When she finally pulled back, she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course I will marry you. I love you too, Matthew. I have loved you almost from the beginning, I think." They were married on a bright April morning in 1879, in the small church in Socorro with half the town in attendance. Penelope wore a simple blue dress, the first non-black garment she had owned in over a year, and Matthew wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed by his bride-to-be. Samuel Reed stood up as Matthew's best man, and Mrs. Chen, the boarding house owner who had become a friend to Penelope, stood with her. The ceremony was short and simple, but the words meant everything. When the minister pronounced them man and wife and Matthew kissed his bride, he felt like his whole life had been leading to this moment, to this woman, to this chance at happiness. They held a small reception afterward, with cake and punch and fiddle music, and Benjamin, who had been brushed until he gleamed, wore ribbons in his mane and accepted treats from well-wishers with dignified patience. The horse that had brought them together now stood as a witness to their union, and Matthew silently thanked the stubborn animal for refusing to leave Penelope that cold December day. Matthew and Penelope moved into a small house on the outskirts of Socorro, a place with enough land for Benjamin and room for Matthew to build a proper stable. Penelope continued her freight business, now with Matthew's help in managing the accounts and securing contracts, and it grew steadily. Matthew's work as a livestock broker for Samuel Reed proved successful as well, and within a year, they were making enough money to not only pay off all of Penelope's remaining debts, but to start saving for the future. Their life together settled into a comfortable rhythm. They worked hard during the day, Matthew dealing with ranchers and cattle sales while Penelope managed deliveries and expanded her customer base. In the evenings, they would sit together in their small parlor, Penelope sewing or reading while Matthew went over ledgers and accounts. Sometimes they would talk for hours, sharing their thoughts and dreams and plans. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. The physical side of their marriage was a revelation to Penelope. Thomas had been kind but perfunctory in the bedroom, treating marital relations as a duty rather than a pleasure. Matthew was different. He was patient and passionate, taking time to learn what she liked, making her feel desired and cherished in ways she had never experienced before. Their intimacy deepened the bond between them, creating a connection that went beyond mere affection into something profound and unbreakable. In the spring of 1880, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Matthew one evening after dinner, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them over her still flat stomach. "I think we are going to have a baby," she said quietly. Matthew's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: shock, joy, wonder, and finally, a fierce protectiveness that made Penelope's heart swell. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "As sure as I can be," Penelope said. "I have missed my courses twice now, and I have been feeling strange in the mornings. Mrs. Chen said these are the signs." "A baby," Matthew said wonderingly. He pulled back to look at her face, his hands cupping her cheeks. "Our baby, Penelope, this is, I cannot even find the words." "I know," she said, smiling through tears. "I feel the same way, terrified and thrilled all at once." Matthew insisted on reducing Penelope's workload immediately, taking over the heavier lifting and the longer deliveries himself. Penelope protested at first, insisting she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal routine, but as the pregnancy progressed and her belly grew, she had to admit that the help was welcome. The people of Socorro rallied around them with a warmth that surprised and touched them both. Mrs. Chen organized the other women in town to make baby clothes and blankets. The merchants Penelope had worked with over the past year and a half gave her gifts of practical items: diapers and baby powder, and a beautiful handmade cradle from old Pete Alvarez, who had become something of a grandfather figure to them both. Even Samuel Reed, who rarely came to Socorro himself, sent a generous bonus and a note congratulating them on the coming addition to their family. The community that had once seemed so indifferent to Penelope's struggles now embraced her and Matthew as their own, and she finally understood what it meant to have a real home. In November of 1880, Penelope went into labor on a cold, clear night with stars bright overhead. Matthew paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal while Mrs. Chen and the midwife attended to his wife. The sounds of Penelope's pain tore at him, making him feel helpless in a way he had never experienced before. He wanted to do something, anything, to take away her suffering, but there was nothing he could do but wait. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually only about 8 hours, the midwife emerged with a tired smile. "You have a son, Mr. O'Connor. A healthy boy with a fine set of lungs on him." Matthew pushed past her into the bedroom, where Penelope lay exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. When she looked up at him, her face was transformed with joy and love and a bone-deep weariness. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Matthew approached the bed with something like reverence, looking down at the small, red-faced creature in his wife's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small, snuffling noises against Penelope's chest. As Matthew watched, the infant's tiny hand emerged from the blanket, fingers no bigger than twigs, and something in Matthew's chest cracked wide open. "He is perfect," Matthew whispered. "You are perfect. I love you so much, Penelope." "I love you too," she said. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, going back and forth between various family names and names they simply liked. But now, looking at his son's face, Matthew knew exactly what felt right. "What about Thomas?" he suggested. "After your first husband. He was a good man and he brought you to Socorro. In a way, we owe him for bringing us together." Penelope's eyes filled with tears and she nodded. "Thomas O'Connor. Yes, that is perfect, Matthew. That is exactly right." Baby Thomas thrived from the start, growing fat and happy on his mother's milk and his parents' love. Matthew discovered depths of tenderness in himself he had not known existed, marveling at the way this tiny person could wrap him around his finger with a single smile. He would walk Thomas around their small house at night when the baby was fussy, singing Irish lullabies his own mother had sung to him, and Penelope would watch them with a fullness in her heart that sometimes felt almost too much to contain. The years that followed were good ones. Matthew's work continued to expand, and eventually, he and Samuel Reed became full partners in the livestock brokering business, which they renamed Reed and O'Connor Cattle Company. Penelope scaled back her freight hauling as Thomas grew, though she never gave it up entirely. She enjoyed the independence and the sense of accomplishment it gave her, and Matthew never tried to stop her from working. They hired a young man named David to help with the heavier jobs, and Penelope focused on managing the business side of things, which she had discovered she had a real talent for. Benjamin grew older and grayer, but he remained a beloved member of the family. Young Thomas learned to walk by holding onto the big horse's legs, and one of his first words was Benji, his attempt at the horse's name. Benjamin bore the child's attention with patient good humor, standing still while Thomas pulled on his tail or tried to climb his legs, and Matthew often thought that the horse knew exactly how important he was to this family he had helped create. In 1883, Penelope gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Matthew's mother. She was a tiny, delicate thing compared to her brother, with Penelope's gray-green eyes and Matthew's dark hair. Thomas, now 3 years old, was initially suspicious of this new arrival who took up so much of his mother's time, but he quickly became fiercely protective of his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feeding time. 2 years later, another son arrived, whom they named Samuel after Matthew's business partner. Samuel Reed was deeply honored by the gesture and became the boy's godfather, spoiling him with gifts and attention whenever he visited Socorro. Their house, which had once seemed adequately sized for a young couple, now felt cramped with 3 children and all the chaos they brought. In 1886, Matthew made the decision to build a larger home on the property, a proper family house with enough bedrooms for the children and a big kitchen where Penelope could cook and bake and manage the household. He did much of the work himself, with help from friends and neighbors, and watching the house take shape plank by plank filled him with a satisfaction that went deeper than any business success. This was his legacy, the home he was building for his family, and every nail he drove felt like a prayer of thanksgiving for the life he had been given. Old Benjamin lived to see the new house completed, though by then He was nearly 25 years old and mostly retired from work. He spent his days in the sunny pasture behind the house, grazing peacefully and accepting visits from the O'Connor children, who adored him. On a warm afternoon in September of 1886, Penelope found him lying peacefully under his favorite tree, having passed away quietly in his sleep. She wept as she had not wept since Thomas Jordan's death, grieving for the loyal friend who had been with her through the hardest times of her life. Matthew held her while she cried, understanding that she was not just mourning a horse but a whole chapter of her life, the bridge between who she had been and who she had become. They buried Benjamin in the pasture under that same tree, and Matthew carved a simple wooden marker that read, "Benjamin, faithful friend and the best horse that ever lived. He brought us together and we will never forget him." The children left flowers on the grave for weeks afterward, and even years later, when they would play in the pasture, they would pause by the tree and tell stories about Benji, the horse who had refused to leave their mother and changed all their lives by his stubborn loyalty. Life moved forward as it always does. Thomas grew into a serious, studious boy who loved books and learning. Margaret became a spirited, independent girl who reminded Penelope of herself. Young Samuel was the wild one, always getting into scrapes and adventures, keeping his parents on their toes. Matthew's business thrived, expanding beyond Socorro to cover much of southern New Mexico territory. He became a respected figure in the community, known for his fair dealing and his generosity. When families fell on hard times, he was often the first to offer help, remembering his own struggles and Penelope's desperate situation when they first met. Penelope became involved in various civic activities, using her organizational skills and business acumen to help establish a lending library in Socorro, and to organize relief efforts when droughts or other disasters struck the region. She never forgot what it was like to be alone and struggling, and she made it her mission to ensure that no widow in Socorro would ever face the kind of desperation she had experienced. In 1889, Penelope surprised Matthew by announcing she was pregnant again. They had assumed their family was complete with 3 children, but apparently, life had other plans. Matthew was both thrilled and nervous, as Penelope was now 37, older than was typical for childbearing in those days. But Penelope sailed through the pregnancy with surprising ease, and in early 1890, she gave birth to twin girls, whom they named Anna and Catherine. The arrival of twins when they already had 3 children made for a chaotic household, but it was a joyful chaos, filled with laughter and love, and the beautiful mess of a large, thriving family. Matthew would sometimes stand in the doorway of their home, watching Penelope move through the kitchen with a baby on each hip, while the older children did homework at the table, and feel overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, this family, this love, it was so much more than he had ever dreamed possible for himself. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, Matthew and Penelope would sit together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the New Mexico landscape. They would hold hands and talk about their day, about the children's antics and business concerns and plans for the future, but sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that comes after years of deep companionship. You ever think about that day? Penelope asked one evening in the summer of 1895, when they had been married for 16 years. "The day you came to buy Benjamin." "All the time," Matthew admitted. "I think about how close we came to never meeting. If I had ridden into Socorro a day earlier or later, if Benjamin had not refused to leave, if I had not decided to help you. So many small things that could have gone differently. I think we would have found each other anyway," Penelope said softly. I do not believe in much of anything being predetermined, but I do believe some people are meant to be together. We were meant to be together, Matthew. I am sure of it." Matthew lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Whether it was fate or luck or just a stubborn horse, I am grateful every day for what we have built together. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope O'Connor." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You saved me, you know, not just from poverty or debt, but from a life without real love, without passion or partnership. You gave me everything I did not even know I was missing." They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found each other in the midst of hardship and built something beautiful from shared struggle and stubborn hope. Their children were healthy and happy, their business was successful, their love had only deepened with time. Life was not perfect, there were still challenges and sorrows, but they faced them together, as they had always done. As the years continued to pass, the O'Connor family became a fixture in Socorro. Thomas, their eldest, eventually went to college in the East, becoming a lawyer and returning to New Mexico to practice. Margaret married a rancher and settled nearby, giving Matthew and Penelope their first grandchildren. Young Samuel took over the cattle brokering business when Matthew began to slow down in his late 50s, showing the same sharp instincts and fair dealing that had made his father successful. The twins, Anna and Catherine, both became teachers, dedicating themselves to education in the growing territory. Matthew and Penelope grew old together, their hair turning silver and their faces lining with the marks of a life well lived. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1904, then their 30th in 1909, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends who had become family over the decades. On a warm spring evening in 1912, when Matthew was 63 and Penelope was 60, they sat together on that same porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. Matthew's health had been failing recently, his heart growing weaker, and both of them knew their time together was drawing to a close. "I am not afraid," Matthew said quietly, holding Penelope's hand. "I have lived a good life, a blessed life. And when I go, I will go knowing I loved and was loved in return. Not every man can say that." "You are not allowed to talk about leaving me yet," Penelope said, though her voice was gentle. "We still have time, Matthew. We have to have more time." "I hope so," Matthew said. "But if we do not, I need you to know something. I need you to know that every single day with you was a gift. Even the hard days, even the days when money was tight or the children were sick or things went wrong, they were all gifts because I got to face them with you. You made my life worth living, Penelope. You made me better than I ever could have been on my own." Penelope was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You did the same for me," she whispered. "You gave me a life I never dreamed possible. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me everything, Matthew." They sat together until the stars came out, holding hands and remembering, celebrating in their quiet way the miracle of their life together. And when Matthew passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, Penelope grieved deeply but not hopelessly. She had loved and been loved. She had built a life of meaning and purpose. And she had 43 years of memories with a man who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to lift her up rather than walk away. Penelope lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, staying active in the Socorro community until the very end. When she died in her sleep in 1920 at the age of 68, she was laid to rest beside Matthew in the Socorro cemetery, their headstones side by side just as they had been side by side in life. On Penelope's stone, her children had inscribed a simple epitaph. She loved deeply and was deeply loved in return. And on Matthew's, he saw someone in need and gave everything he had. Love followed. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to their love was not in the cemetery at all. It was in the family they had built, in the business they had created, in the countless lives they had touched through their generosity and kindness. It was in the story that became legend in Socorro, the tale of the stubborn horse who refused to leave his mistress and the cowboy who saw that stubbornness and recognized it for what it really was: loyalty and love, and the refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost. Their grandchildren would tell the story to their children, and those children would tell it to their children, and so on down through the generations. The story of how Matthew O'Connor came to Socorro on a cold December day in 1878 to buy a horse from a widow, and how that horse refused to leave, and how love, stubborn and surprising and true, found a way. And in the telling and retelling, Matthew and Penelope's love story became part of the fabric of Socorro itself, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning or logical decisions, but from moments of compassion, from choosing kindness over convenience, from being willing to see another person's need and step forward to help even when it makes no practical sense to do so. Because in the end, that is what their story was really about. It was about two people who had every reason to give up, to accept their lot and stop fighting, choosing instead to keep trying. It was about a man who saw a woman struggling and decided her dignity mattered more than his convenience. It was about a woman who accepted help when pride told her to refuse it, who learned to trust again after loss. And it was about a horse, a simple carriage horse named Benjamin, who somehow understood that his place was with the woman who needed him, and who refused to be moved from that conviction no matter what logic or practicality suggested. The O'Connor descendants still live in New Mexico, still tell the story of their great-great-grandparents and the love that defined their lives. And somewhere in the collective memory of Socorro, in the very soil and stone of the place, the echo of that love remains, a testament to the truth that real love, the kind that lasts beyond death and echoes through generations, often begins in the most unlikely ways, in moments of crisis and compassion, when one human soul reaches out to another and says simply, "I see you. I will help you. I will not leave you alone." That was what Matthew said to Penelope in word and deed on that cold December day in 1878. And that was what she said back to him, through all the years that followed, through joy and sorrow, through prosperity and struggle, through the beautiful, messy, miraculous adventure of building a life together. They saw each other, they helped each other, and they never left each other alone. And in the end, what more could anyone ask of love than that?